Hi, and welcome to Middle Eastern Islamic History number 39, where we're going to pick up from where we left off last time, discussing the Assyrians and the Kurds as in the Ottoman Empire, as well as discuss more about what was going on in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle Eastern areas of it. So, forgive me for those who are for those who are familiar. These are the rules. So this is not an academic presentation. I am not an academic accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. I am a layperson, and I will try to give this presentation from a secular perspective, even though there will definitely be religious elements to discuss in today's presentation. I also want to encourage people to be respectful. This is going to be a very difficult topic, especially moving into the upcoming lessons as we get closer and closer to the discussion of World War I. So I encourage everybody to be respectful, but that said, I do like questions, comments, and clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat in real time and will respond to your questions accordingly. What I like to say is that these classes are a 101 and a 201, by which I mean, if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already knew something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. When I put dates below a person, those are usually their years of service in whatever role they have, be it a general, a politician, doctor, whatever. And so those are not the years of their life and death, although it can be. I like to have a 2-hour hard stop. So that's sort of your agreement with me that if wherever we are at the end of 2 hours, that's where we'll stop, and we won't continue to go on and do new material after those 2 hours. We may continue to have a discussion if there are interesting questions, comments, concerns, but you know that after 2 hours, you're not going to miss anything, and we'll just pick it up from where we are last time. And finally, this, like all the other episodes in this series, will be recorded. You can watch it later and see the full trajectory. And that's increasingly going to be helpful as we move into more and more modern eras, because there's a lot of stuff that was addressed in one of the earlier presentations that will be pulled forward in these later presentations. All right. And because of how much we have to cover, I'm adjourning the quiz, and we'll just start from sort of a recitation of where we are. So we've been discussing the Assyrians and the Kurds, which are these two non-Arab populations and non-Turkish populations that exist in the Jazeera region. That is that region that is along the upper part of the Tigris River, into which flow a number of rivers like the Greater Zab and the Lesser Zab, and which some Armenian tributaries, some Euphrates tributaries like the Khabur River also cross-pollinate. And so these are mountainous regions with an incredible amount of social and religious diversity. And we discussed that there are 8 major periods within this Jazeera. And today we are going to cover period 7 and part of period 8. And previously we've covered those other roles. So as we discussed previously, we had this Assyrian Empire. This was the Assyrian Empire at its height. You can see the green areas are the Pihatu or the Pihitu, which are the provinces of the Assyrian Empire. Those areas that are sort of lighter green are the vassal states. And the Assyrian Empire basically controlled most of the Middle East during its most dominant period at around 650 BCE. And then roughly 50 years later was when it crashed, and it was defeated by the Medes and the Chaldeans, or the Chaldeans also known as the Neo-Babylonians. And we then moved on to how the Assyrians continued as an ethnic group under Babylonian domination, including how King Nabonidus was probably a descendant of Assyrians, and how Assyrians continued to manifest their religion throughout the Babylonian occupation, how there were signs of Assyrian power and organization under the Achaemenids, the Persians who defeated the Babylonians. We further showed that when the Achaemenid Empire was conquered by the Greeks, who founded the Seleucid Empire, and the Seleucids were in turn conquered by the Parthians, there was a renaissance in Assyrian development, which led to the development of either Assyrian-ruled countries like Adiabene, or countries that with a large and powerful Assyrian population, like Osroene or Hatra, which were both Arab-run kingdoms. And it was during this period of the Assyrian Renaissance when the Assyrian people were converted to Christianity. In particular, they adhered to what is known as the Nestorian Church, or the Church of the East, which broke with the other churches in 431, that Council of Ephesus. When the Sasanians became the dominant Persian Empire, replacing the Parthians around the year 240, the Sasanians had a much less tolerant view towards Christianity, seeing it as a way that the Roman Empire would insert itself into Sasanian affairs. And this resulted in a number of persecutions that only let up during the reign of Shah Yazdegerd I, who conducted the Council of Seleucia-Ctesiphon, in which the Church of the East was formally inaugurated and became completely separate from those churches in the Roman Empire, and therefore were less of a threat. Despite this, you continue to have persecutions on the one hand, as well as a golden age of culture and literature coming out of the Church of the East after and around the time of the Council of Seleucia-Ctesiphon. This leads to the expansion of the Church of the East all throughout Asia, as we discussed last time, and the Assyrian alphabet becoming the dominant basis for the Sogdian and later Mongolic alphabets. You can see in the lower right-hand side all the different dioceses of the Church of the East, of which the ones in Iraq today would be considered Assyrian. Then the Arabs conquered the area in 637. And then after that, we have the weakening of Arab power around the year 970. Now, we've discussed a lot of this stuff both last time and in the previous lectures. This mostly covers the area between lectures 2 and lecture 6. Right, and you had this Iranian intermezzo. As the power of the Arabs retreated, the Abbasids became an ecclesiastical state. The Iranian states took power, as well as a number of Turkic states that would later come into the area. But we also see Kurdish states developing. This is really the first time in the historical record that we see Kurds as a clear and coherent ethnic group. We've seen the word Kurd appear before as a general category of nomadic Persians, but it's not used as a clear ethnic determiner until this mid-period, but around 950 to 1150. We've seen the term come up previously in some of the dynasties, but these are the first clearly Kurdish dynasties. In some cases, like the Anazids, they had very little cultural impact and they were ruling over a mostly non-Kurdish population. In other cases, like the Shaddadids and the Rawadids, we know that they built their own mosques, they had their own places of burial, and they spoke their own Kurdish languages. The invasions of the Seljuks led to the Kurds being integrated into the Seljuk system of having numerous different statelets all under the power of the Great Seljuk, but increasingly the Turks were outcompeting the Kurds in terms of being able to acquire power, and so the Kurds were reduced to only a few states. You can see on this map only the states that are a greenish color are Kurdish states. The ones that are in yellow are ones that are run by Turks. And so you can see how much more present they are. Even the Armenians, who are represented in this sort of light brown color, where you can see, for example, Cilicia, Kaysun, Sassoon, Moks, they even have more power than the Kurds do at this point in terms of their political autonomy. And of course, we talked about the most famous Kurdish leader in history, that was Saladin, and his creation of a non-Kurdish state. He ran a Muslim state, although his closest family members who shared the dynasty with him were Kurds. We also talked about the fact that it's during the period from around 1200 to 1400 that the Kurds really develop an incredible religious diversity. And this religious diversity is manifest in the creation of new post-Islamic religions. And by post-Islamic, we mean that they have an origin within Islam, but they move beyond it by accepting tenets or beliefs that are contrary to Islamic tenets or beliefs. For example, we have in Alevism and in Yarsanism, we have this veneration of Ali, which transcends the usual understanding of Ali as a human being and sees him as somehow connected to the divine in a deep spiritual way that could even mean that he, in the tradition of Yarsanism, that he was a representation of God in our realm, or as an Alevism, that he was the true light that the people should follow. And as you can see, the Alevis, while circumambulating, they have numerous pictures of Ali, and he is the one who is central, more so than Muhammad himself. You also have religions like Yazidism, which have a completely different cosmology and bring over some elements like this mudahariyat, these emanations of God in the real world from Yarsanism or Alevism, but combine it with a number of other polytheistic traditions that preceded the arrival of Islam, including the concept of reincarnation, which the Yarsani also believe in. You finally have the Shabaki, who have a reverence for Shah Ismail and some of the Kizilbash traditions, despite them not being Turkish. So you have this incredible religious diversity. Of course, at that time and still today, the majority of Kurds are Sunni Muslim, but this religious diversity was enhanced by the fact that the Kurds, being in the mountains, were able to manifest their religious traditions without fear or without serious fear of violence from the Ottoman state because of how isolated they were. During the 1400s, the early 1400s, in 1401, Timur invaded much of the Middle East, especially Baghdad. And Timur, in particular, based out of what's today Uzbekistan, had a deep and abiding hatred for Assyrians and the Nestorian church. He was responsible for mass exterminations of Nestorians. And after his time, we don't see Nestorian Christianity much outside of the Middle East and India, right? The Middle East, because of how many people and how many adherents it had in that area, and India because it had been outside of his reach. But Central Asia, which had previously had numerous Nestorian churches and believers, now no longer did. In particular, Timur was notable for killing almost all of the population of Baghdad, if not all of it. In 1401, he also attacked the Green Church of Tikrit. Tikrit was a majority Assyrian city prior to Timur's attack. After that, Timur became a majority Sunni Arab city and has remained so until this day. Many Assyrians tried to flee Timur by moving into the mountains in the Jazeera region, in that region, right, that we talked about in the northern part of Iraq and the southeastern part of Turkey. And they made the trek through the desert, up winding along the Tigris River until they got to the region of Hakkari. And even in Hakkari, they were not necessarily protected from Timur. He tried to smoke them out from the caves in the mountains that they had hidden. And it was into this situation that the Ottoman Empire stepped. Remember that the Ottoman Empire, as we discussed in presentations 17 through 20, was primarily focused on that area around Constantinople. And you can see that the earliest acquisitions of the Ottoman Empire really focus on the Asian side towards Istanbul, and then getting a European and Anatolian contingent to finally surround Istanbul and take it. So it's not really until Selim the Grim and Suleiman the Magnificent that the areas of the Jazeera really come into Ottoman Turkish world. And because of this, there's a huge difference in the way that the Ottoman Empire manages to treat this region. One in particular is that, right, we had Mehmet building Constantinople in 1453 when he conquered it from the Byzantines. And remember, 1453 is before the reign of Selim the Grim. So the Jazeera is actually outside of Mehmet's conquest. And so when he develops what become the seeds of the millet system, none of the Kurdish religions and the Assyrian church are not, in his view, minority religions of the empire. His view of the minority religions within the empire are the Jews, the Greek Orthodox, and the Armenians. And so they are represented by their millets. But the Kurds and the Assyrians are not represented. The Assyrian churches would eventually come to be represented by their own millets in the mid-1800s, but none of the Kurdish religions were recognized. As a general rule, the Ottoman Empire excluded representatives of the post-Islamic religions from being represented because Islam does not recognize the validity of post-Islamic religions. This was further exacerbated by the fact of when Selim the Grim took control of the Ottoman state, he also conquered Mecca and Medina, making him the caliph of all Muslims. And because of this vaunted religious role that he couldn't jeopardize, and his hold on it was tenuous at best because he was clearly not genetically supposed to be a caliph. Caliphs, as we discussed, were supposed to be Arabs from the Hashemite clan, from the Quraysh tribe, more generally. And since Selim the Grim was not of this ancestry, his claim to be caliph was tenuous. And so recognizing these post-Islamic religions would have cast serious doubt on his legitimacy as a caliph for all of Sunni Islam. Prior to the Ottoman Empire stepping into this region completely, we have a number of powers that are in this region. So in particularly, we have the Koyunlular, or the White Sheep Turks, and they are replaced by the Qizilbash, led by the Safavids, specifically Ismail the First. Now, you can see Shah Ismail expands into the Jazeera in 1508, and he acquires control over all this territory. Right, this is actually the beginning of the creation of the Shabak minority that we discussed last time, right? Because they see Shah Ismail and his extremist Shiite ideology as being sort of their spawning point. That said, when these territories come into Ottoman control, they come into Ottoman control at the very edges of that possibility. And you can see here in this map the divisions within the Ottoman Empire. And those areas in purple are areas that are highly autonomous. So we have to understand the way in which this autonomy worked. And we've discussed it before, but it bears mentioning again because of how important it is. Within the Ottoman Empire, especially as you get further and further from Constantinople, you had what was called the iltizam system. And the iltizam system was based on creating a nobility. That nobility would have control over a piece of land, and they would be responsible for the tax revenue generated from the inhabitants of that land. So in this way, the nobles were granted an incredible amount of power to collect taxes, to organize funds, and to develop the regions in which they sat. Depending on how effectively the Ottoman government was able to go in and change governors of these iltizam, the rulership of those iltizam could be more or less secured independently of the Ottoman power structure. So, for example, if we take a place in Anatolia or Rumelia, these are areas very close to Constantinople, the governors were almost consistently appointed by the Ottoman Sultan. Those would pay the tax. They would be recognized as multazem, owners of an iltizam, multazem, and but they would be subject to a number of strictures and would be required to follow many of the edicts from Constantinople. As you get further afield, especially in places that are more distant, like Iraq, like Tunisia, like Hijaz in what's today Saudi Arabia, you have a situation where the pull of Constantinople is much weaker. And so these multazems are effectively their own independent powers who are ascribing nominal fealty to the Ottoman state and are paying the financial requirement to maintain their iltizam. But you could think of it more as a vassal state in many respects than an actual subordinate part of the empire. They made their own laws, they enforced their own crimes. The revenue that they generated was entirely independent of the needs of the Ottoman government. And so you have cases where these rulers were able to overgenerate and pay what was required of them, and therefore create prosperity. Other cases where they couldn't, and so the Ottoman government would step in and remove the iltizam or refuse to recognize the iltizam leadership. So it creates this sort of empire within an empire of feuding states that exist. In particular, of the ones that we're going to see today, we're going to see a lot of the aghas of the Kurdish regions, because as you can see, the areas of the Jazeera, especially those that are more mountainous, are areas that are almost always autonomous. And the Ottoman power in these regions is almost always at the will of the multazems, in this case recognized with the title of agha. So let's delve into this a little bit. So this is actually a map from the early 1800s. So it's a little later than the period that we're talking about now. But for most intents and purposes, this map really works well for us. All of the areas within that hard black line are parts of the Ottoman Empire. And within those, in the gray borders, are some of the provinces, are some of the iltizam that led to various Kurdish states or Kurdish principalities. Each of these Kurdish principalities were ruled by a tribe of Kurds, and they ruled over a very mixed population. They ruled, some of that population was certainly Kurdish as well, some from the ruling tribe, some from other Kurdish tribes that were not granted the iltizam. But in addition to Kurds being under these rulers, you also had Armenian and Assyrian and Arab and Turkish communities living in these regions. You also had a constant attempt by the different rulers of the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople or the Safavid leader in Isfahan, trying to acquire more or less influence in these Kurdish principalities. And you would have a number of cases where these Kurds were considered to support one side, and so they would be bribed into supporting the other side. You also had a number of wars between these different Kurdish states. And these wars would be over the acquiring of more territory, because remember, the iltizam is based on the land you own, but at the same time, it's based on the revenue you generate. And those revenue requirements exist independent of what the actual territory controlled is, because that's a local issue more than it is a national tax issue. So expanding the amount of territory that any of these Kurdish principalities would take would allow them to generate more revenue, and therefore, with the same requirement to give that money to Constantinople, means more profit for those various chieftains. In particular, because these Kurdish tribes switched allegiances either to the Ottomans or to the Safavids with a certain degree of regularity, especially if it could buoy either of their claims to expand power under the system of iltizam, there were attempts to remove Kurdish populations from the region intentionally so that they couldn't be part of this tug of war of influence. A number of tribes were moved from this area on the Safavid side and sent into exile in the eastern part of Iran, near the border of today's Turkmenistan. And these are called the Khorasani Kurds. You can see a picture of them in the upper right-hand side. These Kurds were deported about 400 years ago, and now there are about 1 million of them living in that northeastern part of Iran, thousands of about 1,000 miles away from the traditional Kurdish homeland, but they form a majority in this region, in this border region of Iran today. And they were moved specifically so that way they wouldn't be part of this tug of war between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. And it's also why there are few Kurdish states on the Iranian side of this border. At this same time, in 1552, we have the increasing connection between Assyrians and the Western churches. And so what ends up happening is that there is a factional dispute among the Assyrian church leadership, the leadership of the Church of the East. And one of the Catholicos who believed in his candidacy wanted the support of Rome against the other Catholicos, because there can only be one Catholicos of the church. And so in 1552, this Catholicos actually got the permission of the Catholic Church to reconcile the teachings. And so, as opposed to the Church of the East, which remains out of the 7 ecumenical councils, right? They failed the 3rd ecumenical council. This group of Assyrians patched up their differences and therefore are accepted as part of the unified church, in particular part of the Catholic Church, just a Catholic Church by the Syriac rite. And so this church came to be known as the Chaldean Catholic Church. So there's no ethnic distinction meaningfully between Chaldeans and Assyrians. That said, from this point on, from 1552 on, the Assyrian community becomes religiously more and more fragmented as each of the different groups of Assyrians choose how they're going to orient themselves, whether they're going to be part of the historic Church of the East, whether they're going to join with the Catholic Church, whether they're going to represent themselves as a distinct Oriental Orthodox Church, or if they're going to align to a certain extent with the Eastern Orthodox churches. And eventually, with Protestant missionaries in the 1800s, you'll also have evangelical and Methodist Assyrians joining this mix. So this meme on the left-hand side is something that I think is pretty funny and sort of represents the difficulty in the Assyrian community today in reconciling all of these different terms for the elements of their community, and the words of the leadership of those communities in rejecting the idea of Assyrian unity, or if they accept Assyrian unity, to downplay the distinctiveness of their own groups. And so there's this tension between the religious distinctions within the Assyrian community. And as you can see from the hands that are reaching each other, the one with the blue star is the Assyrian flag, the one with the red star is the Chaldean flag, and the one with the eagle is the Aramean or Syriac flag. Now, this is something that we had discussed previously when we talked about the Safavids and the Sultanate of Women, episodes 21 and 25. And this was the War of 1578 to 1590. In particular, this was after the reign of Safavid Shah Tahmasp I, and he died in 1576, leaving the Safavid Empire in a state of chaos from which it would not recover for nearly 20 years. And so Sultan Murad III took advantage of this by invading the Jazeera, bringing it under Ottoman control, even extending as far as Iranian Azerbaijan. So most of the Kurdish tribes were under the power of Sultan Murad III. But it gets even more complicated than that, because we have to look at the Emirate of Bitlis. Bitlis is one of these Kurdish states that we've talked about, and the leader of that emirate was a man by the name of Sherif Khaneh Bedlisi. And Sherif Khaneh was his family, the Bedlisi family, was one of the historical rulers of the Bitlis region. And you can see it's in what's eastern Turkey today, around the region of Lake Van. That region is today a Kurdish majority region. At that time, it was much more ethnically mixed. But Sharaf Khan Bedlisi was an individual who was raised in the court of Shah Tahmasp I. So that was part of Shah Tahmasp's power in that region. And he brought the family in. He educated him on art, culture, history. And he was installed by Shah Tahmasp I as the emir of Bitlis around the time of his passing. Sultan Murad III of the Ottoman Empire then came to him from the western side and promised him that if he would take up arms against his former master, that he would recognize him also as the emir of Bitlis, but this time under Ottoman control. And while Sharaf Khan did not immediately switch sides, he switched sides pretty soon into the war, and in fact was responsible for leading a significant percentage of not only the Kurdish, but the Ottoman forces in that war of 1578 to 1580, bringing almost all of the Kurdish regions under Ottoman control, and becoming a renowned statesman in his own right, expanding the power of his territories and being recognized as having that increased power. During the latter days of his tenure, he also wrote what was called the Sharefnameh. The Sharefnameh is the first document that we have of Kurds writing down their own history. Being at the margins of the urban sedentary civilization, the Kurds, by and large, had no recollection of their history in written form. They had oral stories and tales. In fact, much of what we know about the dynasties, the early Kurdish dynasties that we showed, those that were around the year 1000, like the Rawadids, the Shaddadids, the Anazi, the Marwanids, all of these groups come from the Sharefnameh, which detail the historical lineages as the Kurds understand them of their own history, as well as some of their own cultural arts and music as well. In addition, Sharaf Khan Bedlisi was a pious Muslim. He was Sunni in orientation, despite having been raised by the Shiite Safavids. And when he was in power over the Emir of Bitlis, he built a number of Islamic schools. You can see there, this is the Ikhlasiya Madrasi. And the Ikhlasiya Madrasasi was originally built in the 13th century, but he expanded it significantly in 1589 to the current shape that it has now. But of course, this border region would come under Persian control, again, as part of the expansion of Shah Abbas the Great, which we discussed in episode 21. And of course, this would bring the Kurds and the Assyrians back under Persian rule for a few decades. But then Sultan Murad IV brought these territories back under Ottoman control, and they would primarily stay under Ottoman control from 1639 onwards. That said, because of the numerous border clashes, and we'll see some of those coming up, the Ottomans never were able to create an administrative portfolio in this region that was as organized as what they would be able to put together closer to Constantinople, where there was less conflict, and therefore organization could be consistent. One of the things worth talking about, and we addressed it a little bit, is that during the wars of Shah Abbas the Great, there was an Ottoman offensive near what's called the Nakhchivan region today of Azerbaijan, and that offensive would conquer a significant portion of territory. But the Safavid primary tactic to forestall Ottoman advances into Safavid territory was a scorched earth tactic. And so they forcibly removed the Armenians of that region, most of them concentrated in the city of Julfa, and they forced marched them towards Isfahan. Over half of the Armenians forced marched in this way died. The Armenians then settled in Isfahan, and they are the largest Armenian community in Iran today. And this, of course, changes the demography of Nakhchivan quite substantially. And after this point, Nakhchivan will never have an Armenian majority, despite the fact that it will have a significant Armenian minority up and until the 20th century. So, as we mentioned, there were a number of border clashes, and in particular, that's relevant to us, is that the city of Mosul was first the city of Kirkuk and then the city of Mosul were attacked by Nadir Shah in 1743, as we discussed in episode 36. So on the Ottoman side of this, the Ottomans had granted an iltizam to the Jalili family. The Jalilis were an Arab family, a Maslawi family, a family from Mosul, and they had retained control almost as if it were their own principality, and they were the ones who led the defense of the city against the siege for 40 days, which was an incredible resistance, and got not only their local approval for protecting them against Nadir Shah, but the approval of the Ottoman government. And so the Jalilis remained in power of Mosul throughout the rest of the 18th century and even into the beginnings of the 19th century, until the beginning of the provincialization of the Ottoman Empire. Within the rest of Ottoman Iraq, with the exception of Kuwait, because Kuwait comes under British control increasingly, you begin to have the consolidation of power behind Hassan Pasha. Now, Hassan Pasha was a kidnapped slave. He was Georgian by ethnicity, and he had his own coterie called the Georgian Guard of about 2,000 cavalry. And these Georgians were all slaves who had been forcibly converted from Christianity to Islam and were able to run the region quite successfully. Similar to the Al-Jalilis, they created what was effectively their own recognized iltizam of 3 different provinces, especially the area around Baghdad and Basra, and to a lesser extent, the area in northern Iraq. Hassan Pasha and his Georgian guards were effective in both controlling tax revenue and in maintaining the stability of the region, which was no small ask given all of the ethnic differences and the constant threat from Persia. In particular, in 1776, Karim Khan of the Zand Persian Empire, the successor state to Nadir Shah, launched an invasion of Iraq from the sea and conquered the city of Basra in 1776. In fact, he would hold on to Basra until 1780, when the Georgian mamluks were able to take it back. One of the things to point out here is that the Ottoman government actually tried to wrest power from the Georgians in 1776 because of the loss of Basra. And so it shows that the Ottomans could remove these parties from power if they really wanted to. But it turns out within the Ottoman administrator, the Ottoman governor that they put in place, was less successful at repelling the Zand than the Georgians had been. And so Suleiman Pasha the Great, who was the Georgian leader who was removed, actually maneuvered himself in 1790 to take power back and bring Basra back under Ottoman control. And because he did that, the Ottomans were willing to recognize again Georgian control over Iraq, and this continued for quite a while. And so this brings us to the beginning of the 19th century. The last entry into the Georgian Mamluks is actually somebody for whom we have significant information, as opposed to many of the other leaders where we only have scant details. The last leader was Dawud Minash. Sorry, the last ruler was Dawud Manvelashvili. As you can see, that Vili ending is typical of Georgian last names. Shvili, sorry, meaning township. And so Dawud, who was recognized by the Arabs and Kurds as Dawud Pasha, took a lot out of the playbook of Muhammad Ali, who we discussed really in depth in episode 30. Muhammad Ali, of course, being that innovator and modernizer of Egypt. And so he decided that he wanted to develop the Iraqi state in much the same way that Muhammad Ali had developed the Egyptian state. And he may well have been successful. He brought in a number of French military advisors. At this point in time, the French had been kicked out of Iran. And so these military advisors who were very close to Iraqi territory could easily come across the border and begin to teach Dawud Pasha's troops in order to organize under modern techniques. And Dawud Pasha was able to consolidate his strength quite effectively during this period, which led to numerous internal developments, such as the beginning of railroad construction and his first creation of a journal. This is you can see on the right side, Journal Iraq, and this was a paper that was published in both Arabic and Turkish, and was the first Iraqi newspaper discussing the developments within the country. We believe the first edition was printed in 1816. And Dawud Pasha was so convinced of his ability to eventually break Iraq away from the Ottoman Empire and create a distinct state that when the Ottoman Empire called for levies in 1829, this was during their war with Russia, the Russo-Turkish War of 1828 to 1829, the Ottomans called for Dawud Pasha to send a levy to fight in the war against Russia, and Dawud Pasha refused. They demanded that he send them gold bags of 6,000 ingots of gold, and he refused that too. And so he was considered insubordinate. Now, because of the Russo-Turkish War, the Ottoman Empire had to divert troops to the north. But once that had been settled in 1829 with the Treaty of Adrianople, the Ottoman Sultan gathered to him a number of forces, and he sent Ali Reza, who was a lead general in the Ottoman army at that time, in order to remove Dawud Pasha from power in 1831. And that's exactly what happened. The reason Dawud Pasha lost, though, was not because his army was less advanced or less skilled. In fact, there were numerous fights that broke out across northern Iraq, where Dawud's forces and Ali Reza's forces met, and the engagements were less than decisive for the Ottoman side. However, what ended up happening was that 1831 was a bad year in Iraq. There was a massive famine, and after only a few weeks of siege in Baghdad, the city was ready to capitulate because so many had died from disease anyway, related to malnutrition and the lost food supply, that effectively it was the end. Dawud Pasha was executed, and Ali Reza Pasha became the governor, the Ottoman-sanctioned governor of Iraq. And from this point forward, Iraq would be governed as an Ottoman province. Now, it's worth mentioning, again, we discussed this during episode 30. There was an Egyptian invasion led by Muhammad Ali, who had much more success than Dawud Pasha. And that Egyptian invasion conquered most of the Levant, and even won against the Ottoman forces in the Battle of Konya, which, of course, if we remember, Konya is the holiest city in Anatolia. It was the capital city of the Seljuks, and therefore a loss there by the Ottomans was not only a decisive loss in terms of the territory and giving the Egyptians easy access to the roads to Constantinople. But it was also a morale loss for the Ottoman Empire, because this was a city from which the Ottomans gained Turkish legitimacy. And the Egyptians had no shortage of collaborators within the Levant region that would assist or resist their invasion. And we're going to see some of that in a bit. In particular, one of the resistors came from an unlikely source, because this was further east than the Egyptians had gone, but in the same time, forces were sent from here. So you have the Kurdish emirate of Bukhti. You can see it there with its capital at Jizre. Now, Bukhti was ruled by one particular Kurdish emir named Bedir Khan, and Bedir Khan is particularly known for two main things. The first is his desire for increased power and his relentless wars in order to expand the power of Bukhti. And the second one is for his persecution of minorities. In particular, he had numerous attacks against the Yazidi, starting in the 1820s, and throughout his reign, he was quite famous for this. In 1839, the Egyptians were fighting again to control that territory that they had taken in 1831. And so the Ottomans, similar to what they had done with Dawud Pasha, called on all of their multazems to send them soldiers to fight against the Egyptians. And Bukhti responded. In contrast to many of the Kurdish emirates that refused to send soldiers, Bedir Khan sent a contingent to fight on the Turkish side in the Battle of Nezib. Now, the Battle of Nezib was an Egyptian victory, but that didn't matter. The fact that he had sent soldiers and the other Kurdish representatives didn't gave the Ottoman Empire much greater willingness to support Bedir Khan than his other Kurdish emirs. And so he was allowed to expand his territory at the cost of the other iltizam without Ottoman direct intervention. In order to expand his power, Bedir Khan made an alliance with two other Kurdish principalities, the Principality of Mukhus and the Principality of Hakkari. Hakkari, in particular, was ruled by a Kurdish emir named Nur Allah. And Nur Allah demanded tribute from all of the entities under his control, including the Assyrian minority that lived there. The Assyrians at Hakkari refused to pay the tribute. They believed that the tribute demand was too high. And so in refusing to pay, Nur Allah went to his new ally, Bedir Khan, and Bedir Khan saw this as a way of expanding his power. To add insult to injury, the Arabs of Mosul, led by the Jalili family, were trying to expand their power into the Kurdish emirates, and the Assyrians would not fight on the Kurdish side to stop this. So after the Kurds effectively prevailed in keeping Mosul out, the alliance between Bedir Khan, the Emir of Mukhus, and Nurullah of Hakkari then bore down on the Assyrians, and up to 10,000 Assyrians were massacred, especially in the region of Hakkari, but throughout Hakkari, Mukhus, and Bukhti. Additionally, once Bedir Khan had secured his power in 1843 by doing this, he launched an attack on the Yazidis as well, another attack on them. In 1846, another round of persecutions occurred, and the amount of discord was so difficult that the Ottoman Empire sent one of their leading generals, Omar Pasha, to settle the issue. And Omar Pasha brought Ottoman troops, removing Bedir Khan from power in 1847 and creating a new provincialized system to rule over the Kurds. That said, the ability to extend the provinces this far into the mountains and with the adverse terrain was increasingly difficult. And so the power of the Ottoman Sultan, while nominally enforced here against the Kurdish principalities, was only enforced from time to time. So that covers a lot of what was going on in Iraq up through the 19th century. We had previously discussed in episode 26 the development of Lebanon during the 1600s. And during the 1600s, we have the rule of the Ma'an family, led by Fakhruddin II. And the Ma'an family were a Druze family, the Druze being one of those post-Islamic religions. And Fakhruddin Ma'an had a number of different allies. One of those allies had been Ali Jan Bulad. Ali Jan Bulad was a Kurd, and so you can see that the Kurds have moved. The Kurds include tribes that are this far west, but most of the Sunnis who followed Ali Jan Bulad were Turkish as well as Kurdish. He revolted against the Ottoman Empire in 1607, and as you can see from the dates, that didn't end well for him. That said, his family did survive and began to intermarry with a number of Druze families as they had that alliance. Now, the Druze and the Maronites had established a relationship by this time because of Fakhruddin Ma'an's need for Catholic support coming from Europe against his Ottoman overlords. And eventually, the Ma'an dynasty began to fracture, and there became a question as to who would succeed as the ruler of Lebanon. Now, Lebanon at this point has two dominant ethnic groups, the Druze and the Maronites, but there are also minorities of Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and so the question was, which of these groups would lead? This led to a war for the future of Mount Lebanon in 1711, which is called the Battle of Ain Dara. And there are a few notes that I want to make before I discuss in depth what happened here. The first one, and this is often the case with Middle Eastern conflicts today, is that somebody will identify one of the groups of combatants in a civil war, and note the ethnicity and religion of that one, and find another combatant on the opposite side, note the ethnicity and religion of that one, and say that it is an X versus Y conflict based on those religions and ethnicities. You commonly see this in Iraq, for example, where a Sunni tribe and a Shiite tribe might be fighting each other, and so it will be categorized as a Sunni Shiite conflict. That completely misunderstands the kinds of alliances and organization that takes place. On both sides of this Battle of Ain Dara in 1711, you have Druze. On both sides, you have Sunnis. On both sides, you have Shia. And on both sides, you have Maronites, although the majority of Maronites are on one side as opposed to the other. So and just for clarity, Maronites are Catholic believers. So it's really important to realize that the two sides in this conflict, the Qaisi side and the Yemeni side, Qaisi and Yemeni, both referring to Druze tribes. It's not a Druze versus Shiite conflict or something similar. It is actually a multi-ethnic conflict on both sides. And the issue at base power that the two sides are fighting over is monetary allocation, hierarchical division within Lebanon, and the way that the various iltizam are going to be apportioned between the various stakeholders. So you end up having all these different clans fighting on either side. One of the interesting things is that this sees for the first time the unification of two groups that will remain important for the future of Lebanon, and you see the Shihabs and the Jumblats. Now, we talked about Ali Junbalad, that Kurdish leader who launched a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire in 1607 and who married into a Druze family. The Jumblat family is the result of that marriage, right? Jumblat comes from Junbalad. It's an Arabic corruption. Now, the Jumblat family has remained powerful in Lebanon up until today. This is the leading patriarch of the Jumblat family, Walid Jumblat. At this time, we're talking about Sheikh Ali Jumblat. But since the 1700s, that family has played an incredibly important role in representing the Druze factions within Lebanon, which gives you a sense of who won the battle. And the Jumblat family was based at Ba'adran Palace. And you can see Ba'adran below in the Shuf region of Lebanon. Now, the reason for the conflict here is that the hierarchical structure that had survived from Fakhruddin Ma'an was that the Druze, while a minority numerically, were the aristocracy. They were the ones who were holding most of the multazems, and they were the ones, therefore, who wanted to choose who was the governor and the representative who would speak on behalf of Mount Lebanon to Constantinople. Into this fray came the Shihab. The Shihab dynasty were Sunni Arabs from Arabia. And the Sunni Arabs from Arabia, therefore, they had come to Lebanon centuries ago, so they were well integrated. But since they were neither Druze nor Maronite, they could be seen as an even-handed broker in this arrangement. Now, I have a question as to what religion are the Druze. The Druze are Druze. That is their religion. The Druze religion itself is a post-Islamic religion that developed out of the Ismaili faith, which is one of the types of Shiite Islam. And it developed after the veneration of Caliph Hakim of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt around the year 1000. And after Al-Hakim disappeared, a number of people began to venerate him, and that was the origin of the Druze religion. I talk about it a little bit more, I think, in episode 1, where I go through the distinctions of the Druze religion, but several things that are important to point out is that they have their own holy book called the Rasail al-Hikmah, or the Epistles of Wisdom. They have their own prayer structure called a khilwa, and they meet at the khilwa every Thursday. So Muslims meet on Fridays, Jews meet on Saturdays, Christians meet on Sundays, Druze meet on Thursdays. At the khilwa, the Druze population is split into two subsections. There are what are called the uqal, or the learned ones, and the juhal, or the ignorant ones. The majority of Druze are juhal, these ignorant ones, and they are not required to pray. They are not required to do many of their religious obligations. They simply have to be part of the Druze community. The uqal have to be at least 40 years old and taught the traditions of the ancestors, and they are the ones who are allowed to hear the secret knowledge of the Druze. So they are really the guardians of the religion, and the commonplace Druze may know very little of the religion of the religion and its values. So that should sort of explain a little bit of the Druze religion. So at the Battle of Ain Dara, we have this massive confrontation by Lebanese standards, which means there was probably about 4,500 people on the battlefield. Lebanese wars tend to be incredibly small until the 20th century, in terms of the numbers of people who would actually be fighting. Each of these factions may bring 300 or 400 people to the battlefield, which gives you a sense of how divided Lebanon was in terms of these different ethnic groups and clans. But at the Battle of Ain Dara, the Qaisi defeated the Yemeni. And this led to a massive migration of Druze from the Yemeni faction into what's now neighboring Syria, into the Hawran region. We'll discuss that in a little bit. So, because of this migration of Druze into the Hawran, you also see a migration correspondingly of Christians from Syria into Yemen, into Lebanon. And so the percentage of Christians increases at the cost of the Druze. And the Shihab, these Sunni Arab rulers, are the ones who are holding this confederation of Maronite farmers, Druze, multazems together. At the same time, as we discussed more in depth in episode 29, we have the development in Palestine of a very particular multazem named Zahir al-Umar. And Zahir was able to really develop the economic viability of what's today Israel. And the way he manages to do this is through the development of a strong economy. And he does this through several means. The first one is that he begins the idea of growing cash crops. Other multazems had thought about this, but he actually implemented this. And so under him, Palestine became a place where cotton was grown. And even until the early days of the British Mandate, cotton was a main export of Palestine. This brought in increased revenue relative to his obligations, and so that made him quite wealthy. Another thing that Zahir al-Umar did was he guaranteed credit. He would and he would use the money of the state to back loan agreements and other agreements from default, meaning that investors were much more willing to write checks for new businesses and other similar things because they were guaranteed repayment. He also urged Christians and Jews to come to his government, so that way they could expand the trade networks that he had available to him, especially those into Europe, where he could sell his cotton. And so, and finally, he was able to deal with the Bedouin. And we're going to discuss this probably more at length soon. But the Bedouin tended to be very antagonistic towards the growth of large-scale farming, because those were traditionally their nomadic pastoral lands. Despite the name Bedouin meaning desert people, a lot of Bedouins live in semi-arid areas that are suitable for agriculture. And so they had always used violence and tribute payments to assert their power over those lands and to prevent them from being settled by sedentary people. Zahir al-Umar was able to divide and conquer here by paying some of the tribesmen, like the Banu Sakr. He was able to use them as a defense against the other Bedouin tribesmen who were more antagonistic towards his goal of sedentarization and increased economic output from the land. And so this began the trend of using Bedouin against Bedouin in order to secure the sedentary governance. Zahir al-Umar also decided to put his lot with the first Egyptian conqueror. This was Ali Bey al-Kabir. And that entry into the Middle East resulted in increased instability for the Shihabs. But what really, so it's worth talking about how that manifested. So we need to talk about the reign of Bashir Shihab II. As I mentioned, the Shihab dynasty, the Shihab dynasty was a Sunni Muslim dynasty. However, by sometime in the mid 1700s, one branch of the Shihabs converted to Maronite Christianity. And Bashir Shihab was one of the first Shihabs to be born Christian instead of being born Muslim. And this was incredibly surprising from an Ottoman bureaucratic standpoint. Almost always, the multazems were required, the multazems and recognized governors were required to be Sunni Muslims, at least in name. We do have some cases of post-Islamic religious members, like Alawites or Druze, being multazems. But this is really the only occasion, the Shihab dynasty was really the only occasion where you have Maronite Christians who are openly Christian being in this position of multazem. Now, while Bashir Shihab did rule for 51 years of time, that was not consistent. He was often out of power and able to get back into power. So it's worth going through his difficult issues in maintaining power. The first was when Napoleon invaded Egypt, and we talked about that in episode 29. In episode 29, he posed a direct threat to Damascus, which was ruled by Governor Ahmed al-Jazar Pasha, who you can see in the upper right-hand side. Ahmed al-Jazar Pasha requested Bashir Shihab support him against the French. The French requested Bashir Shihab support him as a fellow Christian against Ahmed al-Jazar. Bashir Shihab argued that he should be completely neutral, and this angered Ahmed al-Jazar, who was the eventual victor against Napoleon, and would lead to antagonistic relations between the two for quite a while. In fact, we have numerous cases of Ahmed al-Jazar Pasha supporting another multazem who would fight with Bashir Shihab and try to wrest power from him, like Baz, for example, another Baz Shihab. So that created this antagonism that developed between Syria and Mount Lebanon. The next thing that I really want to note is that Bashir Shihab had a Maronite wife that he loved very much. Her name was Shams. I think Shamsuddin. And but she died, unfortunately, in the early 1830s. And so Bashir Shihab requested to purchase a Circassian slave named Hisn Jihan. Now, if we remember, Circassians are a Muslim group from the Caucasus region, and so Hisn Jihan was herself Muslim, and when he saw her, he was completely smitten, and he had to have her. And so we have one of the strangest situations we've really ever seen within the story of the Ottoman Empire, which is that she was forcibly converted from Islam to Christianity within the bounds of the Ottoman Empire in order to be married to Bashir Shihab. This means that so what we would expect, of course, is the Ottoman Empire to have a completely antagonistic attitude towards Bashir Shihab on these grounds, and we really don't see it. That said, there certainly was Ottoman antagonism towards Bashir Shihab, and it came from several different sources. The first and sort of overriding source is that in 1831, when Muhammad Ali Pasha was invading the Ottoman Empire, as we discussed, Bashir Shihab threw in his lot with Muhammad Ali Pasha. In fact, he had been kicked out of Mount Lebanon in the 1820s by some of Ahmed al-Jazar Pasha's allies. And so when Muhammad Ali Pasha conquered the area in 1831, Bashir Shihab was reinstated, and he began to take direct control. He had a number of enemies, like the Alawites in what's now coastal Syria, who the Alawites, while having been persecuted by the Ottomans, were more afraid of what Bashir could do to them than what the Ottomans would do. And so they revolted out of loyalty to the Ottoman government. The Ottomans would eventually remove Bashir Shihab II in 1840. because of his alliance with Muhammad Ali. And 1840 was, of course, the year that Muhammad Ali was kicked out of Syria by the great powers. But between 1833 and 1840, there's a few events that I'd like to discuss. The first one is that he wasn't always eye to eye with the Maronite leadership either. You can see Patriarch Yusuf VIII Boutros Hobaish, and Hobaish was a patriarch that found very distasteful Bashir Shihab's willingness to feign Islam. And it's sort of important to explain what that is. In the early 1800s, as we discussed in episode 30, the Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia were able to conquer the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which cast into serious doubt the Islamic legitimacy of the Sultan in Constantinople as the Caliph. Therefore, a Christian multazem like Bashir Shihab needed to demonstrate that he was actually a Muslim. And so, despite the fact that he never converted to Islam and was always a practicing Christian, he observed Ramadan and forced his courtiers to observe Ramadan. He also went to the mosque from time to time in order to at least give the appearance of being a Muslim, even though everybody around him knew he wasn't. The Ottoman Empire became incredibly worried about that loss of legitimacy. And the fact that he was willing to feign being a Muslim to avoid Ottoman recriminations received harsh rebuke from Yusuf VIII Boutros Hobaish. And so you have Maronite uprisings throughout Mount Lebanon during the reign of Bashir Shihab, even though he was a Maronite ruler. Again, we have to be very clear that politics in Lebanon has much more to do with individual clan affiliations than it does with strict religious identity. But during the Egyptian control of the Levant, Lebanon was not the only place with all of these internecine struggles and battles. Palestine was also one such place. And so when Ibrahim Pasha had his encampment at Jaffa, it was attacked by local groups. And so we end up having violent riots throughout the country. In particular, as I pointed out in lecture 30, we had attacks on the Jewish community. We had attacks from the Palestinian, if we can use that term anachronistically, Palestinian Muslim community against the Jews in the city of Safed, where the synagogue was looted. And we have attacks from Ibrahim Pasha's soldiers, the Egyptian soldiers, in the city of Hebron, believing the Jewish quarter to be the site of the greatest Palestinian resistance. And this was because the Palestinians had retreated to the Jewish quarter, not because the Jews had actively been involved. During the Egyptian period of control over the Levant, in both Lebanon and in Palestine, we have an incredible amount of corvée labor, hard labor, done by citizens, but who basically do their work for free under compulsion. Following the removal of Bashir II, he is replaced by his son, Bashir III, who is not as effective of a ruler as Bashir II had been. And this leads to an increasing unrest between the Druze and the Maronites. Add to this explosive powder keg the British reaching out to the Druze. And the British reach out to the Druze because they want to send Protestant missionaries into the region. The Druze have no objection to conversion to any other religion. They themselves will not convert, but they have no objection to anybody else converting to any other religion. So if Muslims converted to Christianity, it would not be a problem for them. The Maronites, however, were very troubled by this because the Maronites considered conversion to Protestantism to be denial of the history that they had worked so hard to fight for and to defend. Now, this resulted in Maronites revolting across the country, and Druze acting quickly to put it down. Given the fact that the Druze were much wealthier than the Maronites were, they were able to consolidate a military force much more effectively than the Maronites could. And so you have the Druze militia moving through Christian town after Christian town throughout Lebanon, especially the city of Zahle, which after a lot of Christian resistance was put down by the Druze. And you have thousands of Christians fleeing for their lives from hundreds of villages throughout Lebanon to the city of Damascus to seek refuge. At this time, the French begin to intervene, and in particular, I wanted to highlight the story of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. We've talked about him before. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi had previously been defeated by the French in Algeria and was living in exile in France, but he was brought in to sort of organize the situation in Syria as all the Christians were fleeing there. Now, that doesn't mean that Damascus was safe by any means. The Druze in Damascus began to torch the Christian quarter of the city. And you can see this picture from 1860, which shows what the Druze quarter in Damascus, the Christian quarter in Damascus looked like after the Druze were done going through it. But Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was actually able to get Muslims to support these incoming Christians and protect them from the Druze militants that were pursuing them. In this way, he was recognized by France. For being incredibly devoted, an incredibly devoted humanitarian, if we can use that term anachronistically. After this, the French take a more direct role in the resolution of the civil war. And you can see this is General Beaufort d'Hautpoul. General d'Hautpoul led the French expedition into Beirut, and you can see this sensationalized picture of their arrival with the Maronites throwing themselves at the feet of the French, thankful that they're coming to resolve the conflict. And the French force was significantly more powerful than anything the Druze could put together. This created the basis for what was called the Règlement Organique, or the Organic Law of 1860, which created the Mutasarrifat of Mount Lebanon. Now, you can see on this ethnic map of Lebanon in the dotted lines, so that central area of Lebanon, excluding Beirut, was what was called the Mount Lebanon Mutasarrifat, or the Mutasarrifat of Mount Lebanon. And as you can see, it is a majority Maronite area. Almost all of the Sunni and Shiite regions indicated by the green and purple are excluded from Mount Lebanon. And while there are some Druze regions, right, those blue regions, within Mount Lebanon, the great majority of the population is Maronite. And this government, which was quasi-autonomous, was set up by the French in such a way that it would try to prevent ongoing conflict between the Druze and the Maronites. And it had several interesting features that people who are familiar with Lebanon might see the inklings of the current government from this creation. The first was that the ruler of the province had to be a Catholic. However, they could not be a Lebanese Catholic. They had to be a Catholic from somewhere else. And so we have leaders of the Mutasarrifat, which existed from 1861 until 1915, from Albania, from Greece, from France, from a number of different places, just not from Lebanon. Additionally, there would be a council that would be ethnically diverse and representative of 6 accepted constituencies. Of course, we have the Maronites, the Catholics, represented, and we have the Syriac Catholics represented, and of course we have the Druze represented, but there are 4 others. You have the Sunni and Shiite Muslims, and you have the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Catholics. And that created a constitutive assembly that would organize and legislate for the Mutasarrifat. And this moved Lebanon outside of the traditional multazem system and into the provincial system of the Ottoman Empire. And that provincial system, right, that we saw in in a previous episode, was promulgated by the Tashkil-i Vilayat Nizam Namesi. It finally hit most of this region in 1871, but really it codified what had been going on previously for quite a while, which was this organization of the Ottoman Empire into provinces that would be ruled by governors in sort of a more centralized bureaucratic way. Each of the provinces, called vilayat, would be divided into sub-regions called sanjaks, or mutasarrifas, right, like the mutasarrifat of Mount Lebanon, or the mutasarrifat of Jerusalem. And the sanjaks would be divided into kaza, kasabat, qarya, or nahya, referring to different confederations of villages and how they wanted to disperse that rulership. This was a fundamental shift in the way that the Middle East had been run, because all of this autonomy, all these wars between these different groups that had been completely allowed, for want of a better term, under the Ottoman Empire, were now a thing of the past, and you would have a unified federal system, which meant direct control over the people in the region. One of the important things to talk about for this period is the Circassians. And we mentioned that in 1864 to 1867, there was a Circassian genocide. And the Circassian genocide resulted in the deaths of over 700,000 Circassians in what is today Russia. The remaining of about 100,000 Circassians in their historical homeland, and the expulsion of around 700,000 or 800,000 Circassians to the territory of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the bulk of Circassians were settled in Anatolia, but significant minorities were settled in the Balkan regions and in the Middle East. And this is important because the Circassians are in this very interesting situation once they move into the Ottoman Empire. They are entirely dependent on the loyalty that they have towards the Ottoman government and the monies that the Ottoman government is putting forward to their resettlement. Accordingly, they become part of the centralization efforts of the Ottoman government to unify the empire against the local populations that have historically had much more autonomy. And so we've seen a lot of the Circassian elements causing problems within the southeastern Europe, the Balkans region, and we'll see it again in the Middle East. In particular, I want to draw attention to Jordan. Now, the Circassians in Jordan today have a very specific role of loyalty to the Hashemite monarchy, and that's demonstrated by the fact that the king has his own guard of Circassians. But the alliance between the Bedouins and the Circassians is a development more of the 20th century than of the 19th. And during the 19th century, the Circassians who settled in Jordan were not welcomed by the Bedouins at all. You have numerous clashes between the Circassians who were defending their new towns and the Bedouins who were used to exacting tribute from people that were arriving. The Circassians had already been traumatized by their own genocide and were willing to fight for whatever land they were given by the Ottoman Sultan. This resulted in numerous Circassian Bedouin fights. Of course, the developments in the 20th century of the Circassians defending the Bedouin leadership, of course, the Hashemites are themselves Bedouin, and those are the monarchs of Jordan, comes from the fact that the majority population of Jordan now is neither Circassian nor Bedouin, but is sedentary Palestinian. So they unify against that common possibility of loss of power. But in the early days, there was a lot of hostility between the Circassians and the Bedouin. And we see this in other regions as well. Circassians tend to be very capable fighters and have an incredible loyalty to the Ottoman state, to the point where they're much less conciliatory towards local norms and local developments that may be adverse to their own personal welfare. So I think that considering where we are and how much there is to cover on the Ottoman side, and it sort of tracks a different situation, that it makes more sense to stop here, and we'll do Balkan revolutions in 2 weeks. We'll do the Young Turk Revolution next week. Any questions, comments, concerns? We went through a lot of really complicated history where you have a lot of different groups fighting each other. So any comments, questions? And I think we'll close it up here for tonight.
Yeah, quick question on the Circassians.
Sure.
Do they still exist in Jordan?
The Circassians, absolutely. That picture of the Circassian Guard of Jordan, that's from like 1995.
Wow. Do they protect the king?
Absolutely. No, it's the same way that the Pope has the Swiss Guard. It's the Circassians in Jordan have a very specific recognition for their loyalty to the Jordanian monarchy. And it's very interesting. In many cases where the Circassians have a long-standing settlement, because of their loyalty to whatever the national government ended up being, they have this specific status that is protected. So in particular, for example, in Israel, there are about 4,000 Circassians, and the Circassians are drafted into the Israeli military and have been since 1956. As far as I can tell, between the Zionist settlers and the Circassians, there was never any conflict. So you have this sort of situation that develops between the Circassians and whatever body of power is willing to protect them. And in the Ottoman Empire, as we'll discuss next week and in subsequent weeks, they become part and parcel of the Ottoman Empire's irregulars, right? These are soldiers who don't have proper training and are part of Ottoman enforcement. In many cases, Circassians participated in the lead up to the Armenian genocide, for example.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Ironic.
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing is, and that's the problem with trauma, right? You have a traumatized group of people,
yeah,
and they inflict their trauma on somebody else because they're trying to escape what happened to them. And we see this with a lot of groups that have gone through a genocide or something similar. They're much less willing to be accommodating to norms that could put them in jeopardy ever again. There's a question about the programs. I'm not going to send out a new link for next week. It's the link that already exists that is for the Balkan nationalism. So we'll just use that for the Young Turk meeting. I'm going to duplicate that for the following week, which will be Balkan nationalism. And we actually have a treat. Mark is going to join us that week to present on the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia, which is an interesting situation because a Catholic monarchy protected Muslims effectively from other Orthodox Christian states. So not entirely for humanitarian reasons, but it sort of cuts against this sort of traditional notion of Christians do X, Muslims do Y. Any other questions? All right. Thanks everybody for coming, and see you next week then.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard.